This particular session that we start with, I will be taking this session today and teaching, and I'll be teaching on the origin of nations, a very, very important topic, and these are for the following reasons. I think, first of all, that it's important that we go through uncovering the biblical origin of nations and why we face the issues of racism today. So I'm going to be talking about that. It's because we're in a time where national identities are being undermined by globalism and identity politics. And so really, we do need to be able to see the kingdom of God through the rubble of society's ills. And I think that's so important. We're a little bit like Nehemiah in these times, where there's a lot of rubble around us. A lot of things have been deconstructed in terms of society. And we've got to be able to see the kingdom of God through all of that, so that we don't become prone to the problems in society, and in fact, since linked to what Alina said earlier about becoming victims rather than victors within the world that we live in. The scriptures make it very clear that we are in the world, but we are not of the world. So what are the learning outcomes of this session? Well, the key thing is, what do we mean, of those of the faith, by the origin of nations? Why is it important? And then why is it relevant to us? That's what we're going to be following. And it's not really going to require too much involvement, as it's a teaching session. So be spectating and some degree of participation. So the first thing I just wanted to start on was the fact that this series of teaching is a response to the recent global political movement called Black Lives Matter, or BLM for short. And that has been following the death of George Floyd on the 25th of May, 2020. And the murder of George Floyd has erupted into a political movement. And that movement is bent on turning upside down the existing structures and mechanisms of the state. Wherever I hear Black Lives Matter, it's very clear that it's difficult to know whether that is the actual statement, the campaign statement, or whether it's the organization. And I think that some have begun to realize there's a difference between the two, but not everybody. And so we must understand there is a difference. And specifically on the organizational standpoint of BLM, they are pushing to make huge reforms to the way society views itself. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, because this presentation is not about BLM. But the key thing is to recognize that nothing is black and white in this particular circumstance, and that it's important to understand how we got here. There is a history that has brought us to this point, and that history has been reoccurring. It's not static. And so we're going to be working through that history. If you do have any questions, feel free to log them within the public chat, and we'll do our best at the end to facilitate those questions for you. So the first thing I wanted to do was talk about the word race. I'm going to cover a brief history on race. It's going to be very brief because, as you can imagine, there's a lot of detail on race because it's part of our history and makeup. So I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour through the history on race, covering particular key events or milestones. And then from there, we're going to then look at what the Bible has to say about it. The first thing is that the word race means basically a family, a tribe, a people, or a nation belonging to the same stock, or a class or kind of people unified by shared interests, habits, or characteristics. Now, the original French word for race is actually race, which is R-A-S-S-E, and it's from the Italian razza, which is R-A-Z-Z-A, which means race, breed, lineage, or family. An earlier but etymologically distinct word was the Latin word genus, meaning a group sharing qualities related to birth, descent, origin, race, stock, or family. This Latin word is cognate with the Greek words genos, meaning race or kind, and gonos, which has the meanings related to birth, offspring, and stock. So the actual core meaning of the word race is very different to the way that it's used today. And so we're going to look at that journey from what it originally meant and how it was used to why it's become the way that it's used today. In order to do that, I've got to touch on a few things. First of all, that classical civilizations, for example, from Rome or China, and going back further, we could look at the Hebrew nation as well as other nations. They tended to invest more importance in their society into family or tribal affiliation and distinction rather than an individual's physical appearance. So in history, race was more linked to that description that I gave you earlier, just in the previous slide, about family, about particular groups. It was linked to the group rather than the individual. And so there was a consensus around this general term because it wasn't based on individual characteristics. It was based on family or tribal affiliation and distinction. However, in some of these societies, and that's within them, they did sometimes tend to equate physical characteristics, such as hair and eye color, with psychological and moral qualities. And a good example is specifically is in the way that they assign some of these qualities, whether it's physiological or moral. They assign them to their own people and to those who might be of a lesser class or to outsiders. So within these societies, if they were going to undermine specific characteristics, it was related to those within their classes, or it was related to those who are complete foreigners. For example, a historian of the 3rd century in the Han Dynasty, and this was in the territory of present-day China, it's interesting, they described barbarians who had green eyes and blonde hair. They described them as the monkeys from which they are descended, which I thought was quite an interesting flip, considering that today any use of the term monkey is usually in a racist connotation is usually ascribed to those of darker skin, but in China they ascribed the people as monkeys who had blonde hair and green eyes. So that's an interesting part of history. The Greeks and the Romans, they conceived the idea that human diversity was affected by geography and environmental factors. So there was an understanding in societies that where there were physiological differences, there wasn't a general acceptance that this was down to the fact that people lived geographically in different places and were impacted by those environments. Hippocrates, of course, believed that factors such as geography and climate played a role in the physical appearance of different people. He writes, the forms and dispositions of mankind correspond with the nature of the country. So he spoke much on the subject. And this is also something else that he stated. He stated that the temperate climates created peoples who were sluggish and not apt for labor, whilst extreme climates led to people who were sharp, industrious, and vigilant. So there was a general, in his time, there was an awareness of the importance of how environment impacted the physiological as well as psychological behavior of people. He also stated that peoples of the mountainous, rugged, elevated, and well-watered countries displayed enterprising and warlike characteristics, while people of the level, windy, and well-watered countries were unmanly and gentle. So those who were higher up seemed to be a lot more enterprising and warlike. Those who were lower down seemed to be unmanly and gentle, which I thought was quite an interesting observation. Now, when we move along a little bit, the European medieval models of race generally mixed the classical ideas we've talked about with the notion that humanity as a whole was descended from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which are the 3 sons of Noah. And as a result, it produced distinct Semitic, Hamitic, and Jephetic, I always get it wrong, Jephetic, I always get it wrong, peoples. So there was a common understanding within European medieval models that race was linked to the history of the Hebrew people. However, with the advent of naturalism, and to make sense of the world, philosophers and scientists began to organize and categorize their discovery. So in this time, as the natural world was being explored, there was a natural inclination to categorize everything. You know, whether it was plants, whether it was amphibians, whether it was fish, whether it was land animals, there was this desire to put everything within a category to try and figure out the world and to make sense of the world. And the Italian and French philosopher Giordano Bruno from 1548 to 1600 and Jean Boudin from 1530 to 1596, they attempted to create a geographical arrangement of the known human populations based on skin color. So that was a very interesting approach, but again, it was built on this previous classical idea. And so they recognized that skin color played a part, but it was led by the environmental factors. And so they tried, in this whole period of classification, they tried an attempt with the populations they knew existed to try to classify geography and skin color. Now, German and English scientists, and this is now moving on to the 17th century, by the name of Bernhard Wahren and John Ray, they classified human populations into categories according to stature, shape, food habits, and skin color. Okay, so we can see here that due to that recognition of that broader environmental impact on people, they became aware that there were differences, and that those differences were down to different things. There were a variety of different criteria that affected the reason why people were who they were. And under the auspice of this movement towards categorization and classification specifically, this is the structure that they used to help them. In the 17th century, the French physician, François Bernier, and he lived from 1625 to 1688, he's believed to have developed the first comprehensive classification of humans into distinct races. And this was published in a French journal article in 1684, and it was called A New Division of Earth by the Different Species or Races Which Inhabit It. So this is really the first time you begin to hear is race, but this is the first time you begin to move away from that to hear races. And those races built on the distinction of those differences that I showed you earlier in the few slides that were being explored. So we see really the classifications beginning to take their own momentum when we see races, the idea of races come to the surface. Bernier advocated using the 4 quarters of the globe as the basis for providing labels for human differences. The 4 subgroups that Bernier used were Europeans, Far Easterners, Negroes, and Lapps. So he saw the 4 corners of the globe as becoming the way to classify and categorize groups of people, built on subsequently the ideas of others. Now, when we move on a little bit further, in the 18th century, we start to see a change. And this is because partly in part down to this gentleman by the name of Johann Frederick Blumenbach from 1752 to 1840, where he divided the human species into 5 races in 1779. And that's just these are the races that we're more familiar with now, or we may have heard of now. And some of this is even sitting within our documentation, our national documentation, and the influences of it. So we have the Caucasian race, we have the Mongolian race, the Ethiopian race, the American race, and the Malayan race. So these models began to emerge, which were a lot more, whereas before they were much more, the classifications are broader. Now they're beginning to become more specific as you see subcategories appearing within the classifications. Now, it did include variations, and so you have Australoid and the Copoid race. So in other words, as they began to discover new groups of people, they began to realize that, oh, we haven't fitted them within our classification. So either our classification's got to remain the same, and we put them within an existing category, or we have to add new categories to the classification. And that's the attempt that they were making. All of this is very experimental in this period because there's a lot of debate, a lot of discussion going on as these people are trying to make sense of the world around them. And now we come towards the end of the 18th century. And there were two major streams of thought that was influencing the whole concept of race. We're moving from race, which is linked to family and tribe and nation, and it's now moving towards races because of this level of classification and categorization that's coming in as the men are beginning to discover more about themselves. And these two main classifications, which really became quite the major sort of discussions amongst the philosophers and scientists at the time, were to do with monogeism and polygeism. Monogeism was the original belief that humans descended from one common ancestry. So in other words, if you go back, everyone comes from someone. Whereas polygeism was different. It was a belief that races actually evolved separately in each continent and shared no common ancestry. So it was this branching out to a much more independent set of classifications of different types of humans. So by the time we arrive in the 19th century, the conversation about race literally evolves. Because with the advent of polygenism, naturalists began to attempt to change race from a taxonomy of classifications, which I've showed you in previous slides, but they began to introduce the biological superiority of races. So we start to see taxonomy, which was happening previously around types of humans, move to what we would say is the biological superiority of races. Now, I'm just going to move on by sort of giving you a summary of what I've just talked about, which should help. We see that first, race began as a family, a tribe, a people, or national belonging to the same stock or a class of kind of people, and that they were unified by shared interests and habits or characteristics. That's where we started. But then, as we move along, the racial anthropology gets introduced. That racial anthropology was a way of classifying the difference between people by physical, environmental, behavioral, and psychological traits. So we see within the progress over from the 16th onwards, 16th up until the 19th century, we see this movement towards the classification of people on the basis of their physical, environmental, behavioral, and psychological traits. And that becomes the grounds upon which we see racial hierarchy develop. So racial hierarchy, another term for it, is the biological scientific way of using empirical evidence to support or justify the difference and superiority of races. So in short, when we summarize that period, we see that the challenges that we face today arose out of a process whereby the differences in humanity were disconnected from a specific historical timeline and then engrafted into an evolutionary historical timeline. You see, when people were thinking about race, even up to the point of racial anthropology, they were not thinking about evolution. They still saw everybody as human beings, but being impacted by the environments and the geography they lived in. However, with the advent of evolution, what it substantiated was removing those ideas, those racial anthropological ideas, removing them from a timeline of history to a timeline of evolutionary history. So, in order for us to be free from the legacy of racial anthropology, okay, and hierarchy, so to be free from racial anthropology and hierarchy that we've become accustomed to, we need to stop entertaining a history which cannot speak back. Much of that history that I've talked about that has led us down the lines of racial anthropology and hierarchy hasn't come through a transfer of history, inheritance, and heritage through people. It's come through an observation of the past that we have no witnesses to qualify. And so it's really important for us that we stop entertaining that history and we break with that history. Because that history will only continue to create the grounds of a racial divide, or the grounds of races within the future of humanity. And in order to break free from that racial anthropology and hierarchy, we need to return to a source of our history, which helps us to understand why we are the same but different. So why is the human race the same but different, has differences? And so to do that, we have to turn to the past that was filled with racial anthropology and hierarchy and say, stop following me. The Bible says we're not related. And so in order to begin that, we need to look at what does the Bible have to say about why we're the same but different. I wanted to start with a scripture to help us, and that is Deuteronomy 32, verse 7 to 8. It's a wonderful scripture. It says, remember the days of old, consider the generations long past. And then it tells us to begin to communicate with those generations. It says, ask your father and he will tell you, your elders and they will explain to you. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all of mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. And so remember, I talked about no longer speaking to a history that doesn't speak back. Well, now we're talking to a history that does speak back. Now we have a record of history that has something to say. And in Deuteronomy 32, we're admonished to reflect on that history. And it tells us to remember specific historical events. It requires us to refer to the writings of those times that have been written by our fathers and our elders. It requires us to accurately reflect on the truth of those events and to consider those events in light of our own times. And it leads us with this question, which is, so when did the Most High give the nations their inheritance? Because within there, he says, not only did he give them their inheritance, but when he divided all of mankind and he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the numbers of the sons of Israel. So looking back into the biblical history creates a completely different timeline and series of events that help us to answer why we are different, why we're the same and why we're different. So who is the first father that I would speak to about this history? Well, the first person I would speak to would be Adam. And in speaking to Adam, I would discover that we were all made in God's image and that we were created to be God-kind. And following the rebellion from the garden, we forfeited our inheritance of being God-kind. And that's when we became mankind. And so there's an element there where we see the beginnings of two histories. On the one hand, there is that which is linked to God's original intention from Genesis and what he desires and his plans The other is this new timeline that is born out of rebellion, that is moving away from God and not to God. Our biblical history is consistent with the original meaning of the word race, i.e., a family, tribe, or people or nation belonging to the same stock or a class or kind of people unified by shared interests, habits, or characteristics. So at this point, these two different strands start from one place, which is the same, and that is this idea of a family, a tribe, a people, or a nation belonging to the same stock. But they diverge not long after. If I then moved on to another generation in that timeline, that biblical timeline, and let's say I spoke to Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, we would discover from Genesis 10 that we descended from Noah, we are his descendants, and that following the global flood, we were dispersed for trying to build a new type of dominion through a city called Babel. The sons of Noah, and that specifically around Genesis 10 and 11, are also known as the Table of Nations. And this is really important. The Bible itself has already defined the nations on the earth. So we can't just look at nations on the earth through the lens, through the glasses of what we see today, which really is a manifestation of war, colonialism, and the reshaping of territories. That is not the original set of lines that God created when he addressed our descendants after the flood, and set about new lines there. Now, the reason why that's important is when we as a people talk about the nations on the earth, we should see it through the lens of the Table of Nations, not this second history that's come out of the rebellion. And when you refer to Genesis 10 of the Bible, it represents a traditional ethnology. And now, so our source of information about the history of the human race is an ethnological source. And ethnology is the science that analyzes and compares human culture, and what it means by that is social structure, language, religion, and technology. The Table of Nations provides the evidence that all humans on earth are descendant from Noah's family. A gentleman by the name of Arthur A. Custance, he was a world-class researcher and a scholar on the subject. And this is what he had to say about the Table of Nations. Remember that there's been hundreds of books written about nationhood, about the history of man. But the Bible has a way of smashing all these books to pieces with just one or two chapters. And that's what I find remarkable about the Table of Nations. From chapter 10 to 11, it fundamentally addresses the history of humanity in a very simple way. And this is what Arthur A. Custance had to say about it. He said the 10th chapter of Genesis stands alone in the literature of antiquity. It is a unique document in that although it is preserved in essentially Hebrew literature, there does not seem to show any bias for or against those who later became their chief enemies. It appears to be a very ancient document. Of this fact, there are numerous internal evidences. Professor Korch of Hull said that he's a scholar of international repute and of higher critical persuasion, says the so-called Table of Nations remains, according to all results of monumental exploration, an ethnographic original document of the first rank, which nothing can replace. So the reason why I wanted to flag this is because we can guarantee you that when we talked earlier, when I shared with you earlier about the journey of race to racial anthropology to racial hierarchy, you can be guaranteed that the Table of Nations was not included in the thought patterns of those who were working through their process of categorizing humanity and ultimately bringing hierarchy and superiority into humanity. But these two chapters lay down the evidence for us of not just the fact that we were created in God's image and we've fallen, but that all of humanity is equal. And it's on an equal platform, not because it made itself equal, but because God made it equal by sending out through the line of Noah all the nations into the earth and allotting them their space and their place. Now, another reason why I want us to focus a little bit on why it's so important, the Table of Nations, is because when we get to Genesis 11, we see that the reason why, remember I talked earlier about we're the same but different. The distinction that the Bible applies to our difference is not the same classifications that the scientists and the philosophers throughout the centuries used to classify humanity. The Bible classifies the difference in humanity based upon two things. And that is, as a result of what happened at Babel, the difference came through language and speech, and then the fact that they were sent out to disperse across the earth. So language and speech becomes a fundamental key element as to why we are different. We're the same because we were created in God's image and likeness, and we've fallen, but we're different because at Babel, God confounded our language and speech. Our ability to communicate and to build a new form of dominion, he interrupted that. Because he did not want man building a dominion that was not in keeping with the dominion mandate that he had originally given to men. And so what makes us different is what God did, not what we see in our environment. That's not the primary reason we're different. The Tower of Babel is the basis upon which we were separated out, and that was done by the Lord because at one point we were of one language, one speech, and he confounded our language, and that's where the beginning of difference started. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. Now, another thing to be very clear on is that from the text you can read in Genesis 11, 1-4, humanity at that point didn't want to be scattered, didn't want to leave. There's no intention. The society had begun to build itself up, a city was established, and they wanted to establish their dominion. But it was God himself who came down and in the midst of that confounded the language, and the language created the distinction. And that language led the way for men to go in separate directions. Now, whilst we might look back and call that a scattering, it was not a scattering. Because the Lord was involved, it was a planned event. The dividing of humanity across the globe has been absolutely planned. And it may not look like that on the ground, but as far as the Bible is concerned, prophetically, it is the strategic work of God. And we're going to cover why that is. So I'm going to talk about 5 things of why it's important that we hold on to the Table of Nations, why we study it, why we seek to make sure that we have an understanding of it, and how that has impacted history. The first one I've already mentioned, our origins. All right, that's the first one, or the fact that we come from God, and the fact that we were the descendants of Noah and his 3 sons. The second of why it's important is about the sovereignty of God over the nations. In Genesis 10, verse 5, it says, "By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations." I'm going to read that again because it emphasizes language again. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. Now, what you will notice when you read that, and whenever you read the Bible talking about the dividing of the Gentiles or the dividing of the peoples, it always roots itself in the original meaning of race. It never introduces a different category, classification. It never introduces according to eye color or according to this or that. It always roots it in language and then roots it in families and in nations. It follows that original meaning of the word race. Now, because of the book of Genesis, we can understand that following Babel, the Gentiles were settled in their nations and allotted inheritance. And this is really important because Babel comes before Abraham, okay? And I've mentioned this before in previous teachings, that for many of us, we're unaware that all of the nations, the 70 nations that come out of the sons of Noah, okay, the view that God has on the earth of the 70 nations that come out of the sons of Noah, he established them all before he established Israel. So Israel were the last nation to enter into their inheritance. And so much of the time within church, you never hear the conversation about all the other nations having their own inheritance. You never hear that. What you always hear is about Israel getting its inheritance. But you don't realize that God had already established the other nations, and last, he was going to establish Israel. So when you go on to read about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and you go on to read about Moses, you're reading about that particular work with that last nation who were going to be, we talk about I think the principle of the first shall be last and the last shall be first. You're looking at that principle there of the nations being established, but the model nation that God had in mind to teach them about the kingdom now comes in at the end. And that's when you're reading the whole saga of Abraham up to Moses and Joshua with the promised land. So the sovereignty of God, understanding the table of nations, helps us to understand the sovereignty of God and that God is in charge and that he has already established the nations, and then he's working with his nation to bring his nation through and establish his nation as the lead. So Israel were the last nation to inherit the land allotted to them through God's promise to Abraham. Now, the next point is about the classification of people by nations, not characteristics. And I've mentioned this before. This is why we are completely different from the humanistic view of the history of men, because God has defined the classification of people by nations, not by color, not by eye or hair or shape of the body. And he's done that because he created those nations in the first place. Do you remember a few months ago I said that we need to understand God as a nation builder and a nation destroyer? So the reason why God classifies people within the context of families and nations is because he intently created them at the table of nations. He knew exactly what he was doing because he divided their tongues. He divided their language. So he was the one that had created in the history all of the nations that you see today that have sprung out from those 70 nations. And so because of that, the defining characteristic of a person is based on their nationhood, not on their individual characteristics. In Genesis 10:32, it says, "These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generation in their nations. And by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood." And so finally, we talk about the reasons why men were separated. Okay. And we have that reasoning in Acts. It's God orchestrates the separation of humanity after the flood. He positions nations across his land, the earth, because it's his inheritance, it's his land. He then brings Israel through all of that as a model, and they inherit the Canaan, and they enter in the promised land. And now every nation has its own land. But there's a problem, you see. And that is that, why has he done that? Well, he's done that because he says it in Acts 17, 26 to 27. He says, he have made of one blood all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitations, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. You see, God knew that while the nation was together at Babel, they would not seek after him. But he knew that if he dispersed them into different parts of the earth, into the four corners of the earth, they would be left amongst themselves in their own squalor to finally look for him. The other thing as well that the patriarchs understood from this history was that they understood that men would also, because of the lust of the flesh, would not stay within their dwellings. They would not stay within those areas that God had predefined for them, those nations. And so they knew that what they would do is they would desire the dominion of others. They would desire to extend their dominion into the jurisdiction of others that God had predefined, and they knew that. And so the history of the Old Testament provides evidences of nations expanding beyond their jurisdictions. So when you now go through the Old Testament from the book of Judges through to Kings, through to Chronicles, right up to the time of Daniel, you are seeing the fact that the nations do not stay within their jurisdictions, but they cross over into each other's jurisdiction because of the lust of the flesh. They want to, and the pride of life. They want to increase. They want to grow. They want to take over. They want to dominate. They continually want to have dominion in their own way. And so that's where we begin to see the rise of empires. Now, I want to say this. God had put them in their own lands so that they could, at the end of history, nobody could have the excuse to say that they didn't have a chance to have dominion. See, God has given this period of time for humanity to learn that its dominion is not as good as it thinks it is. And even into this day, we have nations who are very boastful and proud, thinking that their way is the best way. And it's just not. And so it's really important for us to get this big picture view of these nations conquering one another and just demonstrating how poor their dominion is. And it's the conquest of these nations stretching beyond the space that has been given to them by God that causes what? Well, it causes the issue of slavery in the world. It causes the issue of poor resource management in the world. It causes the issues, the psychological issues that impact us. It causes the classism that springs up from it. You know, if I go and take over a country, that country by default will be under my feet. You know, in the days of kings, when they conquered a king, they would demand for that king to come and bow. And then some kings would place their foot on the neck of the king that they've conquered. All right. And what that meant was that his entire nation was now subservient to that king that had done the conquering. And that's the issue with the dominion of men. The dominion of men will always steal, pillage, and destroy the dominion of others. Okay, so it's important we get this. The reason why men were separated out was because together they would produce something even worse. And yet when they were separated out, God understood that they would destroy that which was given to them, their own inheritance, and they would seek after others and destroy theirs. But he, in his skillfulness and his strategic prophetic nature, he had already factored all that in and knew that in the midst of it, it would be an opportunity for some to look for a new king, to look for a new kingdom, and to desire it. And so by the time we get to the book of Revelations, we get to this wonderful bit in Revelations 5, 8 to 10. And it says this. It says, when he had taken the scroll, the four living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song. Worthy are you to take the scroll and open its seals, because you were slain, and by your blood you purchased for God those from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign upon the earth. In other words, God's strategic plan to divide the people up from Babel, to establish them in their lands, knowing their natures, knowing what they would do. He had created a way that after that they would then begin to come together on again and seek after his appointed king. And having found his appointed king, they would turn their weapons of war into tools that would cultivate his culture. Before we have some questions, I'm going to just end on this just to help. And this is really to help you to see the difference within the race outside of the biblical narrative and the race according to the biblical narrative. I'm hoping that this session will just lay a good foundation for us to build over the next few weeks. And so, as we can see on the race outside of the biblical narrative, it had a common understanding. They both had a common understanding of race. There was a common definition, but one line moves away from that. It moves away to evolutionary origins. It moves along the line of mankind. It focuses on racial anthropology and the physical, environmental, behavioral, and psychological traits that make humanity different. And as a result, within the context of fallen nations who are lustful through imperialism, it builds a racial hierarchy. Okay? When we talk about colonialism, colonialism is a manifestation of imperialism. Imperialism is a manifestation of a racial hierarchy underpinned by a racial anthropology. Does that make sense? These are layers in the psychology of man. But when we look down the line of the race according to the biblical narrative, starts off as this race that is linked to the common definition of family and tribe and nation. And it moves then into this ethnology. That's our space. Understanding the differences is ethnology for us, not anthropology per se. Ethnology is about the social structures, the language, the religion, and technology. I should have put language first because the fundamental difference that occurred at Babel was the language. Okay? And then what does it move into? The sovereignty of God over the nations. Because God orchestrated the difference through language, which ultimately led to different types of societies with different religions and technology, nonetheless, he was in charge of it until the time allotted for him to begin to restore all things back to his son, to himself through his son, Jesus Christ.